Hi, everyone. We're going to give it just 1 or 2 more minutes. Let everyone join. All right. Looks like people are joining, so we'll get started here. So, hi everyone. I'm Sarah Fellner, our VP of Global Marketing here at PKWARE, and we're so excited to welcome our speakers today. From Bloor Research, we have Alan Roger, Senior Analyst specializing in GRC, Security, and Cloud. And from PKWARE, we have Field CTO EJ Pappas with over 25 years of experience in data security. EJ specializes in all things compliance, endpoint and servers, cloud security, both as a technician and executive advisor.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Pleased to be here.
It's great. So hello, folks. Alan and I have been talking about this for a little bit of while. A little bit of while would be the technical term on that one. And we're excited about this webinar today. The agenda for us is that we are going to start and talk about the evolution of compliance requirements and see how they have changed over the last 2 and 3 and 10 and 12 years to see the differences in the rigor and the way that compliance activities have gone. We'll move then to how machine learning and AI can help with data classification and policy enforcement. We'll discuss some of the data discovery techniques that work within an organization, both across cloud, on-premise, and in those hybrid environments. And then we will discuss the balancing of human oversight into the compliance process and how that adds to and augments the changes and challenges that exist within multi-regulatory environments. And finally, we'll wrap that up with talking about future-proofing your compliance strategy as it relates into this ever-evolving and changing regulatory space. So let's move forward on the slides. And Alan, I'm going to let you kind of talk about this evolution that we go forward with, and I'll comment, as I often do.
Oh, sure. Okay. And hello to everyone who's listening, as well as having said hello to Sarah. So this is just kind of looking back over this century, if you like. But of course, legal and regulatory compliance is nothing new because governments have always had to legislate to protect their economies, citizen consumers, and of course businesses as to keep the whole thing moving along successfully. And repeatedly, you see a process of industries maturing. I think even back to the electricity industry long ago, a load of individual providers all doing different things, but then standardization coming in and ways of interacting, developing on a technical front in that example, and then laws that govern the industry fitting in around that for the common good, really. And that lets the industry itself become more efficient and to innovate in a more considered way. But then back to our diagram, the last 20 years have seen the legal restrictions on people or legal obligations and regulations begin to affect almost all types of organization across business as a whole, as we see it now, getting away from the technical and the electrical context. And that's really true across all areas in which business has become, the economies have become developed. Probably most relevantly, the finance industry had a real hit after the kind of Enron crisis just post 2000, and to a degree that the US government really had to react to that and legislate because they recognised there was a real problem there. And so the Sarbanes-Oxley was a requirement that came to bear on lots of finance companies. And that began to change the tech industry to focus on what it needed to do to help with legislation like that. And in fact, the opportunities that arose. And then, of course, just a few years later, just kind of in the 2005 to 15 period, around about the start of that 2007-8, another big hit in economic terms from things going wrong, things not being conducted as they should have been, and that's had brought more regulation towards the finance industry. But at the same time, with things getting more and more digital, it was felt that the security side needed to be underpinned with ISO 27001 and data. We saw the first kind of regulation of data directly in the healthcare industry with HIPAA, because there was concerns about with more digital processes in that industry, how citizens' data privacy was affected. Going ahead slightly further into the 2010s, GDPR was a sort of another stage on the data privacy front. And by the time the GDPR laws came into force across the EU, some other countries like Brazil and Singapore already had their own way forward on data privacy. Probably the biggest difference that GDPR made was the reach of the penal measures that went way beyond the borders of the EU itself, and GDPR is EU legislation. For example, the regulatory measures applied to companies that operated in the EU or even held any data relating to an EU citizen. So, that came into force and was kind of seen as the gold standard, really. And this extension of the reach of legislation was really quite widely felt to be justified. And so GDPR has kind of been duplicated in a way. You've got CCPA in California, and different areas of the US are starting to go in the same direction, really. Another example of an area where we've seen a lot of legislation more recently is in ethical and environmental and social governance, ESG. At one time, that was a corporate accountability that only boardrooms would really feel the effects of. But now its scope is so wide that it can cover a great deal of different things, such as policy to combat climate change, diversity and inclusion, the opposition of human exploitation, such as people trafficking or slavery, and more. So
sorry. No. I was just going to say as we were getting towards the recent part of it, the biggest compelling fact to me around the burden of compliance was that, you mentioned Sarbanes-Oxley at the beginning of your narrative, and it's 2002, and the two biggest sticking points, or the two biggest penal requirements, one was top executives promising that the information in the financial reports was true, and that there were actually listing of internal controls. So, I mean, it was a I promise that this is right kind of effort. And as you talked about walking through this climate, when you get into the GDPRs and the CCPAs, we are talking about the rights of individuals to say, you as an organization can't have my data, which means an incredible amount of rigor for an organization to be able to have to say, I know where your data is. I know what your data is. I know where it's being located or how it's being used. So, I mean, I feel like this, the PCI rigor, the fact that we're on 4.0 and they're adding more amendments to it, and they're changing, being even more strict and more aggressive about knowing how you're mining that data, or where that data is living, or how long it can live in particular places. I think that it's very interesting that compliance never, it never steps backwards, right? It only gets more rigorous. It only gets more granular. It never gets less. And so as we work from the GDPRs and the CCPAs to the advent of the FedRAMP things and the AI types of regulations that I think you're just going to kind of talk into, it is invasive. We have to be very, very mindful of what we're handling, what we have, and how it is being used. And so I think that the onus is so much more on the holder of the data to what they're doing with it versus the consumer of how it's being used.
I agree, absolutely. And another really important thing to understand in the context of GDPR originally, and a lot more of this legislation since, has been that that same responsibility then devolves into your suppliers, your third parties, and the kind of digital supply chain. And now nobody really does the entirety of their processing, their digital work on their own. They'll have a specialist service that does something. Well, the same stipulations that apply to you as the primary organization in terms of your treatment of the data, you then have to make sure that they are followed within that digital supply chain by all your providers. And that brings a heap of work in the compliance realm in terms of contracting with them in the first place to check that they're able to do that, and making sure that they keep those responsibilities in mind, and that's still done. Otherwise, there are all ways in which non-compliance penalties can be attracted.
Yeah, and I think you made that point. I think one of the other interesting components of that to me is you talked about your suppliers, and again, I think the advent of this was GDPR. Is here's a European regulation that then extends into the States and into every other country where is my data in your organization? Is my data, have you held my data, and how did you get it? And what are you doing with it in terms of that aspect of it? And you talked about the supply chain. We also get regulation now that kind of talks about uh, sovereign pieces, right? My data can't leave this. Your data center has to be in Germany. It has to be in Switzerland. It has to be in, no data can leave this particular domain or this particular territory. So again, it really lends itself hard to not only keeping track of what you have to keep track of, or keeping track of the data itself, but knowing where it is and what it is and how it's being used. So it's the clamps are really on, and the eyes are really on everything that is being done to any piece of this data.
And those last few things we've spoken about, which are all big things to achieve, to actually get done, nobody had to do, or almost nobody had to do, or most of the organizations that now have to do those didn't have to do them up till the time of GDPR. So within 5 to 10 years past, those are new things that people have had to find ways to do, and inevitably drive up costs. And we've helpfully provided the results of a survey which was done by an organization called Coalfire, which specializes in the compliance area. So they asked a few hundred customers about compliance costs as they mapped out over the period 2021 to 23. And over 50% of organizations declared that their compliance costs had gone up. In the case of a fifth of those organizations, their compliance costs had gone up more than a quarter. So, for some of the reasons we've discussed and more, compliance is an area which is, just the costs are out of hand, really.
It's amazing, and I think it's to say that they're up a 25% is still conservative, in terms of the fact is that if you're thinking about maybe from 21 to 23, maybe it's up 25%. But again, as we talk about this early Sarbanes-Oxley stuff of, do you have controls? Yes or no? It's from that to, what do you have about EJ? Where is EJ's data, and how many places is EJ's data? The burden is great, which means that it's very difficult for individuals and organizations to be able to keep track of this stuff. And so you need to find automated ways or better ways of being able to handle that data. So on the next slide, we start talking about the concept of dealing with big data, or dealing with lots of data, and putting better controls around it. And I think that there's a balance between automation and innovation within the space. So, Ellen, why don't you? I'm going to let you go first in terms of just kind of talking about how the boxes fit together, and then shockingly, I've got a couple of opinions about it too, as you may.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, so, just as we were talking about compliance costs there, that end of 23 period is really previous to most organizations beginning to do more serious things with AI, which has really happened this year. And although there's a lot of hype about it, not everybody is doing that much very seriously, but there's a lot of momentum and good reasons in many cases to do more with it. So the thing that connects the two is that compliance is coming in the realm of AI as well. Specific compliance requirements to AI from things like the EU AI Act, but all the data that you have that responsibility for at the moment, and to which things like GDPR applies and so forth, is the input to your AI to getting the best value out of AI. So these two diagrams are kind of showing, just at a very basic level, the key to making the most out of your enterprise data via AI is to feed your data into models that apply to what you do. And so that goes into machine learning, which will have a model then, or output a model that best portrays your organization, and that then feeds the actual AI that goes into integrates with business processes and so on. But all of that is based on the data that you currently have. So anything that's wrong with that data at the start of that process, as it goes into a model, or as the model's at date, or as the business processes which are integrated with AI pick up that data, is going to make any resulting problems worse still, because it might actually muck up whole processes, as well as giving errors in answers and things like that. So the mechanisms for looking after data, the governance, the management, and the data security, the data protection, are all the more critical in the future when we're going to be using AI more and more.
Yeah. So when I think about this challenge, or this opportunity, if you will, for the organizations, we talked about the rigor, and we talked about how compliance is just becoming more and more granular. Well, that means that ownership of the data becomes that much more critical, because again, where that data is, or who has your data, is infinitely important. And so what data companies do, organizations that deal with data, have the opportunity to learn from the data, but they're the owners of the data. So how do you learn from your data while still keeping track of it and being a good citizen in terms of compliance and in terms of governance? So anonymization and neutering, if you will, of data becomes paramount to the training of this information. We have seen countless examples of data already with AI models, with the in Microsoft's infrastructure, and Amazon's infrastructure, and Google's infrastructure, of data being leaked, that training data that comes out that suddenly has relevant particulars that go on within it. And we have PKWARE has specifically kind of thought about this model of dealing with the data. So, one way of using machine learning is to be smart about what the sensitive elements happen to be within your organization. So knowing what an address looks like, or knowing what a W-2 is, or knowing what a social ID number is. So you have to be able to be smart about recognizing 9 digits versus 16 digits versus just answers into a spreadsheet, if you will. So machine learning puts rigor into things like into regex, into the ability to be smart about what you're finding. AI says, I'm going to look at this in a holistic manner and take a look at a document in general, or a column in general, and make better decisions based on this other information that I happen to have. What we think about those kind of decisions is that if we're looking at individual data, individual user data, where I live and what I have is more important than who I am, right? So it doesn't have to be EJ, it has to be my city and location that I live in and the amount of money that I make. And if I have children and if I have cars and I have a house, those are the interesting factors that an organization would be able to utilize so that they can then make other either marketing decisions or other types of decisions around handling of the data. So I believe that the best course of action in terms of balancing data and governance is accurate data discovery, knowing exactly what kind of information you happen to have in your organization, and driving that through automation by saying we can rigorously go through, know what information we have, not only in general senses like credit cards or HIPAA type information, or privacy types information that we've been talking about today, but also specifically who that is so that we can wash that, make it John Smith, make it, Sally Jones, so that the rest of that information doesn't have to be, deleted. As we know, deletion is the easiest way to not have sensitive data in your organization. But as an organization that handles data, you need to be able to understand, mine that information appropriately so that you can make better decisions around it. My last point on this one, Ellen, is that I always think when people talk about mining data, it has kind of a negative misnomer to people. They're like, oh my God, they're going to do something else with it. But it's also the kind of thing to say, you know, if I go on a lot of trips to London, and then maybe I should maybe it would be useful for me to see what hotels or what activities that happen to be in London. That could be in my feed because that's a narrative that might be interesting for me. Or if I travel during the holidays to New York City or to LA, I would maybe want to know more about those particular areas or those particular sites. If I buy particular things, then I should be able to have more of the sames of that. So, mining doesn't have to be a bad thing. We don't have to be exploitive with that, but we could be uh, it could be additive, if you will, to the experience that you happen to have. But that balance with artificial intelligence is that artificial intelligence inherently just does the task faster. It doesn't necessarily do it more efficiently or more necessarily more accurately, right? It's still a moving scale, if you will.
Yeah, and it may come up with new insights that you'll more readily come up with new insights that we haven't had to think of directly. But all the same, if it's not connected with reality, bad news.
Yeah, exactly right. So the next slide that we have just kind of talks about the impacts within that AI provides to our particular data holding, but data security strategies that we happen to have. So when I look at this, when I look at the impact that AI provides, the first one that is on this chart talks about AI-driven data discovery and classification, and so that is, if we harken back to that second slide or that slide that we talked about originally, we talked about the Sarbanes-Oxley and the GDPR slide. So much of that was done through assessments. We would provide assessments to organizations and say, okay, you tell me about this thing, and then we would return those assessments to people, and then we would build risk profiles based on the information that we had received from 50 reports or 50 assessments or 100 assessments or whatever that happens to be. AI can go back out and drive through this information much more efficiently or much more effectively than having an individual have to go through and do that. But the decision about that information, what we're culling from that information, doesn't necessarily is not an organic kind of thing. I think there's a little bit more art to the science of that. So ensuring that accurate discovery and accurate classification goes back in. People use AI today around discovery and say we can get 93 or 94% accurate within it. And we think that sounds like a good number. I mean, 93 or 94 sounds like a great number in terms of data discovery. But if I said that your home wireless network worked 90% of the time, or that your phone worked 93% of the time, you wouldn't be happy about that. That's not a good number. That means that's dropping almost 10% of the time. So when you're talking about discovery, being nearly accurate with discovery is not a good thing. You want to be more accurate and you want to be the most accurate. And so having things like confidence factor in your results, or having things like the ability to marry AI to regex or to other types of balance, to be able to balance this effort, I think is super important to getting to the level of assurance that you want to be able to utilize AI for. So, and yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to say you're absolutely right about that. And the thing that struck me as well is that all the time, volumes of data that any organization is dealing with are growing and growing and growing. And so, having automation, definitely an essential step. Having AI help with it, um, but hopefully means less need for human intervention, because the skills are hard to come by and so forth as well. And anything that can help to drive that to be better and faster is really an essential, because at the end, the actual insights that come out of the data as well need to be as fast as possible too. So they're all
Exactly,
means of getting that. And
exactly right.
another
And I
thing,
think,
with the compliance background as well,
Mhm.
using those automation tools is a good way of getting the actual process that's undergone to add to the record keeping that arises. So with a lot of compliance needs, you not only got to have a record that you're sort of ticking the box, but how you did it, how did you come to that decision? Well, if you've got automation of the tools doing that, then you've got a record of that, and thankfully, records that reflect what you've actually done rather than having to delve too deeply.
No, exactly. You beat me to the point. And I was just going to say
Oh,
that, just as that what you were saying, continuous monitoring, right? And that real time mapping or real time of discovery allows you the ability to not rely on the actions of humans to get pieces done, but you have the assurance that as data is created, data is discovered, and as data is discovered, data is cataloged. So now we know what we have almost instantaneously, which then takes the burden of governance to be around protection, not around discovery. It shouldn't be, I didn't know that I had this. I didn't realize that the information was here. I didn't know that I had data on my endpoint that was sensitive. I didn't realize that I had put something into Dropbox or put something into SharePoint that it didn't need to be. This is about, we already know it's there, and we should have protections in place or policies in place that we can then point to your regulatory team or to your audit team and say, there isn't sensitive data in this location because I have a policy that tracks for it. And I have automation that tells me that it is automatically being tracked and encrypted or deleted or redacted or whatever that happens to be. So we reduce that burden because now policies are not based on location. They're based on simply the type of data that you have to have. And I think that, when we that this last bullet, we talk about predictive compliance. To me, what that means is I have a policy that says, for example, I can't have um, a credit card for just simple case. So, a credit card in a location. I can't have a credit card in my organization that is in the clear. Well, that's great. I don't have to say I have a policy for my endpoints that do this, and I have a policy for my cloud repositories that do that. I have a policy for my databases. I can say I have a policy, and then those other places are merely targets to my version, and we just are looking at the various targets and then applying the same policy and the same rigor across. So now you don't have to manage 5 policies for 5 different targets. You have one policy that crosses those things. And then, as you were saying before, you now can just focus on what the protections need to be. versus
And not
one.
only that, yeah, that's a really good point. And not only that, as an extra benefit, whichever regulations now and in the future have that requirement built in, that obligation, you're ticking the boxes already there because you've done it. Such a
Yeah.
basic thing.
Yeah, you're not starting from zero again. You're exactly right, Alan. Exactly right. That goes in. So I think this leads perfectly to the next slide, which is this kind of I love when we say the words value chain because that suggests that we're moving up. We're moving up the chart, right? But I'm going to let you kind of go through the first piece of this one, and then I'll just comment on it. But I like the building blocks that you've put in place that get you to assurance and confidence at the top.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to make the point that, we might focus in on, and it's extremely important to focus in on data, but we don't just keep it for the sake of it, but really to add value to the organization and drive financial success. And data is increasingly the key asset for organizations, as in any industry and whatever they do, they become more digital. So to get the most value and insight out of the data via our applications, and increasingly assisted by AI, we definitely need that data to be accurate and reliable. And that needs all these combined capabilities shown underneath the red portion of the pyramid that ultimately delivers that value, and that users and customers are most directly in touch with. So data security as the foundation, ensuring that the data is kept confidential, not compromised, and doesn't disappear from the organization. And as you said, EJ, wherever it is an extremely important point. And the more of that you can look after in one go, the better. But then because of the volume and complexity, we have to know what kind of value can be extracted from the data, and by classifying it and organizing it, we then know in what way it can be analyzed and to get that right. And with compliance in mind, we have to be sure of what the organization's rights are to use the data, and that the quality is right as well. So we get to the top of that pyramid, but unfortunately, it's also the kind of the tip of an iceberg, it struck me. Have we changed slides can we change slides to the next slide? So that remains there, but alongside that, we've got standards and regulatory compliance now continuing to evolve in great numbers and more quickly. And I kind of do GRC things a lot of the time, governance, risk, and compliance. Somebody mentioned the early, not very long ago, that there are over 250 regulatory changes coming the way of many organizations per day. So, to know what's happening is absolutely essential, and to be looking down the line at what's coming. And as new technologies are coming along as well, there's an increased focus on data and those new compliance requirements. So looking ahead at what's coming down the road, at the technology and at the regulatory regime, and what compliance needs will be ahead. How are organizations that they need to be sure that they can be capable of adopting the technologies and adapting to those new requirements. And, some of the recent challenges are still kind of bedding in. So concepts like privacy by design, which came out of GDPR and is recognized as being really good, and really good from the point of view of citizens, for one, having a real trust in what the organization does with its data, but they're still evolving as they try to build those into new applications and processes. And privacy and data security in general are areas that illustrate well how training and culture needs to be played into how the organization commits to look after data properly, because people are, employees really, are a really significant risk, because they can't be automated no matter what policies you put in place and are convincingly executed by splendid software and so on. The people can't be automated, and they might always do something they're not supposed to, whether it's discussing things they shouldn't discuss, Or, AI provides an example of one thing that they could do. And anyone, I'm sure a number of people, and it's been reported reliably that people have been tempted to enter corporate data directly into Chat GPT to see what kind of value can come out of how AI treats it. But Chat GPT is a model that doesn't bear in mind all the obligations that you have for your corporate data security.
I think that
So go
yeah,
on.
you're making that point. I use a simple adage all the time when it comes to security and governance, which is users don't care about data security. Users don't care about governance. Users care about getting their job done. So if it's 2 clicks to be safe and 1 click to get their job done, it's 1 click all the time, right? The user is just trying to move from task to task and journey to journey. And I think that even in that evolution that we've talked about in terms of governance, that original, that base building block of data security, um, the technology industry has kind of fooled itself in saying that, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the data is protected. I'm going to encrypt the disk. I'm going to provide encrypted transport from point A to point B, and therefore my data is protected. But what governance is telling us is that it is more and more about the data, and it's more and more about the user, and it's more and more about the what of that information as we move, up the pyramid on the right, and as you talked about the areas of focus. So we need to make sure that we are using AI uh, to provide the rigor and diligence so that we can make sure we can classify the data, that data management peer that goes back into that we can then utilize the security of the data and the organization or classification of that data so that we can have better governance and have that level of assurance and then apply AI to those building blocks. Not AI in lieu of the building blocks, but that should be the additive nature of what's going on. We're trying to get better value outside of our data, not utilizing it as to fill the gaps of where we happen to be. So you talk about privacy enhanced solutions and privacy first governance kind of pieces. It means that you have ownership of your data and you own what what you have and how you have it. And so if it's not necessary, you get rid of it, you discard it, you quarantine it, you delete it. And if you have it, then you need to handle it as appropriately, as a good citizen, if you will, of that data. So to me, it becomes a nature of building blocks within your organization and being adaptive and being rigorous around knowing what's coming next. It only gets more difficult. And so if it only gets more difficult, then you need to make sure that you've got the appropriate foundation to be able to take that protection and move it forward.
I just wondered whether you'd seen in the context of your customers situations where they've focused on the tech side and got all the good tech in place and policies and so forth, but someone's let them down through a slip up that they shouldn't have made, and that's highlighted the need for that kind of training I mentioned.
Yeah, well, I would say so. We, PKWARE has 21 of the top 23 banks worldwide, and so the most heavily regulated organizations, whether they're insurance companies, whether they're financial institutions, and the like, many of those companies have to worry about the data, worry about the user, and so the only way to worry about the user is to be able to assume that all of the places where users are creating data are being accurately monitored. So ironically, it feels like as everybody talks about moving to the cloud, we forget that data is created on endpoints and within organizations and on file servers and on phones and tablets and the like. And so where that data is being created is where we have to provide the levels of diligence. So I have found a number of our customers in that, certainly in the financial sector, but also in the insurance sector, which has a lot of personal data that we have to deal with. Um, those organizations need to be mindful of how they're dealing with it. So whether it's the JP Morgan Chases or the Citibanks or the State Farms of the world, or the credit card companies, we need to be able to ensure that we can protect their data, identify it and protect that data as it's being created, so as to ensure that the user, in spite of themselves, are protected with the data that goes into the next model. I loved your ChatGPT example, because we have lots of customers today that are looking at what can we do to help. What can you do to help me when users want to put stuff into ChatGPT, or how do you protect the user from co-pilots and from AI agents that are being utilized across the board? So that we have to fit into that model, and that to me is where that's where my communications with my customers is going today, and I think that's really where we need to be moving in the future.
So that speaks to the kind of last point on this slide about having adaptable frameworks, which helps to spread that protection and encompass as many situations as possibly can be, really. Strikes me as an awful lot of work. And is that going to become more productized and accessible to, I keep mentioning all the organizations that are affected by the compliance side? If they could all use means like that, then all the better. But how accessible is that sort of thing?
Well, we talk about AI today as this elixir, right? That's going to solve the world's problems. And then we also talk about large language models as being, we're going to take data and put it into these large language models, which then suggests that, and it's tough enough for an organization to keep track of their own data on premise, right? How do they put security controls in place with the data in a location that they think that they know where it is? As they move that data to the cloud, or they share that data with third parties, like the Amazons and the Googles and the Microsofts of the world, we're then assuming that those organizations are keeping they're keeping track of the data in the same way as this data is being spread across the world. So I feel like what AI does is that it provides a burden around, giving more. You're not only worrying about your own IT staff protecting the data, you're worrying about everybody else's IT staff protecting their own data that happens to go there. So I find that it's the small language models. It's the smaller purpose-built AI tools that are going to be in place, that are going to say, you need to protect this particular piece of data in this particular way at this particular time. And that it's almost disposable in terms of, let's create it, let's protect it, let's now move on to the next piece of it, as opposed to this homogeneous, everything goes into one spot and then we're going to figure out what we're going to do with it next. I think we're going to be much more purposeful, purpose built in terms of the way that we're going to be using it, and it's going to be surgical and targeted. So organizations like PKWARE need to be mindful of the particulars. Let's cleanse training data before it gets into the model. Let's identify the data before it gets into your lower environments that may then be stretched into it. And I think that that's, to me, that's where you're adaptive, is that we should make the assumption that no data is safe and that all data needs to be looked at, and that we're going to utilize whatever tools we have necessary or at our disposal to make that happen.
And I think as with the clamor for AI to be adopted, used, and the benefits of it and so forth, alongside that, to kind of make sure that the need to do the right thing with the data and to have all that in place before you start to pump it into AI, that what the point we've got on there about data ethics and everything that comes underneath that needs to really does need to go organization wide, and for people to not be told in a listen to this way, but to realize what the importance of getting that right is in terms of their business results that they can expect from AI.
I totally agree. And I think that that's the one benefit of, I'm sure there's more, but the one benefit that I can think of at the top is that AI has provided an excuse for these disparate parts of a enterprise organization to begin to talk to one another again. So now the chief security officer should be talking regularly to the chief data officer, who should also be talking to the chief risk officer, and making sure that those policies are not in silos, but that are in alignment, that they're working together to identify what the next threat is, what their common threat is, and what their common response to that information happens to be. So I think I think we solved the problem, Alan. I think we're all set. We should just talk about next.
We might
So
have raised a few questions in people's minds, though.
I hope so. I hope so indeed. So Sarah, do we have any questions that we might want to answer right now before
Yeah.
we
Yep.
time?
Yep, we do. Let me pull them up here. There were a few. Okay, so the first one that came through was, how do you recommend organizations approach the challenge of harmonizing policies across multiple regulatory frameworks?
Okay, I can pick up on that because, as I mentioned during the course of what we've discussed, focus on GRC a lot of the time, so governance, risk, and compliance solutions, and getting that close to security and business processes, getting things, all the compliance needs that we've talked about, getting that to happen as near as possible to what people actually do is one of the key means of making this all hang together well. But it's without doubt that there is a huge burden of compliance there. Breaking compliance down into the type, we mentioned something as a control, the policies that you mentioned, DJ, of one policy being able to look across, whether data's in the endpoints or the cloud or it's in motion somewhere. That's an example of that very harmonization, really, of doing the right thing once, so that wherever it comes up as a requirement with various compliance drivers, it's done, and you've done it already. So it's kind of an investment in doing that, really. And what GRC solutions can do is to map that control that says, yeah, my policy does that. How does that can map into compliance with, say, GDPR, CCPA, and the different things that you've done. And then you've ticked multiple boxes from having done one thing. And you've got all the traces and so forth that you need.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I would say, Sarah, that when I hear that question, what comes to mind to me, number one, is that this is where the data management folks and the risk folks, or the GRC folks, come together. So this is knowing your data and knowing what the elements of your data happen to be, allow you to apply those consistent elements across the board. So there are sensitive elements that are a part of HIPAA, that are a part of PCI, that are a part of GDPR and CCPA, that there are some commonality that goes across those. So having automation in place that allows you to know where that information is and how that information sits in your organization gives you the best starting point of deciding how you're going to protect it. And then you get to have decisions. Your harmony is, do I need to protect it the same way for each of these policies, or can I document at least the ways that I should have those pieces and parts put together? And so I think that gives you the step up. So having your compliance folks lean on your data management folks at the beginning to say, make sure you can give me a good heat map of where my data happens to be, is the best starting point for you to be able to figure out what you do next.
Okay, and the last question is, and I think you guys kind of touched on this, but maybe we'll just dive a little deeper into it. So the question is, what do you believe will be the most significant compliance challenge for data-driven companies in the next 5 to 10 years, and how should they start prepping for it now?
Well, I'm gonna let you finish with this, Alan. I'm gonna go first, just and say that my belief is the regulation has gotten closer and closer to the user and to the privacy components of it. I think, we're getting more intimate with our discovery. And I think that the next thing that's going to happen is that it's going to become domain specific. So I think it's going to become, geographically pervasive. So I think that, even today we see the different rules that Singapore has around data handling and how those apply to the rules that are in Germany and the rules that are now, in the various states. So Virginia's got a particular privacy act versus California's act versus Texas's act versus the, the New York, the, DFS 500 acts that happen to be there. So I think that we're going to have a lot of the next step of this is just going to be geographically specific. And so we're going to, again, just be needing to be mindful of where is your data residing, who touches that data, who has access to that data, and then how it's being used.
Yeah, I think yeah, that's a good point. And that the sort of big picture of the regional or semi-global data privacy, it's become perhaps a differentiator in some points, and people do have different regional differences and things like that. Very importantly, also you mentioned sovereignty, because when you get those sort of more localized data regulations, sovereignty can come with it. So that will probably become more local as well.
Okay.
I think the other important thing to mention is that we've talked quite a lot about AI, and that really is a huge compliance challenge for sure. So it's going to drive compliance more into the actual processes themselves. And again, I'm seeing that coming from the GRC focus that I have as well. So interesting times.
Indeed, Alan. I think, and that's when you talk about sovereignty, and I'm saying that I feel like Sarah, here's my big hot prediction for the future is that whereas AI has started with centralized data so that people can make informed decisions, this large language model kind of metaphor, is I do think that the future is more localized and smaller models that are being more specific towards tasks. So I think that since there will be regulation that talks about private data being sent into the cloud and then being accessed across the globe, that's going to get attacked and that's going to get regulated. I think organizations are going to try to move towards smaller models to be able to handle specific tasks, to try to find a better way to legislate this and a better way to provide controls over privacy. And I think we're out.
Yeah. Thank you guys all for joining us. Alan, thank you. EJ, thank you. If anyone has any questions, you can always go to our website, pkware.com, and we'll make sure that we have one of our experts get back in touch with you and make sure to get your questions answered. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining, and we will see you all next time. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, EJ.
Thanks.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, TJ.